Have you ever stumbled upon something that shook everything you believed about the world? Something so bizarre that your brain struggles to process what your eyes are actually seeing. Before we get into this story, I need to know where you're tuning in from right now. Drop it in the comments and let me know your location. I love finding out where our listeners are, especially when we're about to dive headfirst into something as deeply unsettling as what unfolded on the Cumberland Plateau back in 1898. This is the story of a man who unearthed a discovery that should have stayed buried deep within those ancient mountains, and what followed when he carried pieces of it back into civilization. The year was 1898, and Vernon Ashcroft was 37 years old, a hunter and fur trader who worked the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean and weathered like the hickory trees scattered across the ridge lines he called home. His hands bore the scars of decades spent skinning and tanning, and his left eye had a peculiar tendency to drift out of focus, the lasting result of a close encounter with a wounded black bear back when he was 23. Vernon had spent his entire adult life in those mountains, learning their secrets the way other men learned to read, and he took great pride in knowing every hollow, every creek, every game trail within 50 miles of his cabin near a settlement called Harlan Station. He lived alone in a cabin he'd constructed himself, about 7 miles from his nearest neighbor, a distance he actively preferred, because it meant the game was plentiful and the quiet was absolute. His only regular companion was a mixed breed dog named Striker, mostly hound with something else woven in that gave him an unusual sharpness and an almost uncanny ability to track wounded animals through terrain that would confuse most hunting dogs. Vernon earned his living selling furs and occasionally guiding wealthy men from Lexington or Louisville who wanted to hunt elk in the high country, though those opportunities were growing scarcer each year as the animals thinned out. He supplemented his income by harvesting ginseng root, which he sold to a Chinese merchant who passed through Harlan Station twice a year, and by running trap lines through the winter months, when the pelts were at their thickest. It was late October when Vernon first caught word of the skulls, passed along by a man named Josiah Pendergast, a peddler who traveled between mountain communities, selling everything from needles to patent medicines. Josiah was in his early 50s, a short man with a noticeable limp from a childhood injury and a remarkable talent for collecting gossip the way Vernon collected furs. He rolled up to Vernon's cabin on a gray afternoon with the wind carrying the scent of approaching snow, his wagon groaning under the weight of his goods and his stories. Josiah told Vernon about a farmer named Silas Cornett who lived in a remote valley, roughly 20 miles southeast, near the Virginia border. Silas had recently been clearing land for planting and had turned up something peculiar while shifting rocks from a hillside. According to Josiah, Silas had uncovered several skulls buried in the rocky soil, skulls unlike anything anyone in those parts had ever laid eyes on. The story might have ended right there, just another piece of mountain gossip, except that Silas had apparently taken one of the skulls to a doctor in Middlesboro, and the doctor had offered him for $50 on the spot. $50 was more than most mountain farmers saw in half a year, and Silas had turned it down, sensing that if the skull commanded that kind of money from a doctor, it might be worth considerably more to someone else. Vernon took in this story with the healthy skepticism of a man who had heard tall tales his entire life. But something about it lodged in his mind. $50 was serious money, and doctors didn't throw that kind of sum at ordinary curiosities. He asked Josiah what made these skulls so unusual, and the peddler leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. despite the fact that they were entirely alone, save for Stryker dozing beside the fire. Josiah said the skulls didn't belong to any creature anyone could identify. Not bear, not elk, not even the panthers that still occasionally prowled the highest ridges. The eye sockets were too large, the jaw structure too foreign, the cranial capacity too expansive for anything that had any business existing in those mountains. Silas had reportedly shown the skull to several old-timers who'd spent their whole lives in the region, and not a single one of them could tell him what animal it had come from. Vernon asked whether Josiah had seen the skull himself, and the peddler confessed he hadn't. He'd only heard the account from Silas's brother-in-law, who had been present when the doctor made his offer. But Josiah had known Silas for years, and he swore the man wasn't prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. If Silas said he'd found strange skulls, then strange skulls had indeed been found. The peddler mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Silas had told his brother-in-law there were more skulls still in the ground, where the first had been found. Dozens of them, perhaps, all buried together in what appeared to be some kind of mass grave or deliberate burial site. After Josiah rode off the following morning, Vernon couldn't shake those skulls from his thoughts. He tried to focus on his work, checking his trap lines and patching the roof of his smokehouse before winter closed in, but his mind kept circling back to what the peddler had told him. $50 for a single skull, if there were dozens more, and if he could reach them before Silas decided to dig them up himself, or before word spread to others who might try their luck. Vernon stood to make enough money to finally purchase that bottomland. He'd been watching near the Clover Fork, maybe even enough to stock it with cattle and start building something more solid than his current hand-to-mouth existence. He spent 3 days wrestling with the decision. Part of him recognized that digging up strange bones from a burial site felt wrong somehow, like disturbing something that had been hidden on purpose. But the practical side of him, the side that had learned to wring survival from these unforgiving mountains, reasoned that bones were just bones, and if some city doctor wanted to pay good money for them, who was Vernon to argue with the transaction? He'd killed and skinned hundreds of animals over the years, sold their pelts without a second thought. How was this any different? On the 4th day, Vernon packed a week's worth of supplies, loaded his rifle and tools onto his mule, and headed southeast with Stryker trotting out ahead. He'd managed to get better directions from a neighbor who knew Silas Cornett's farm, though the neighbor warned him that Silas wasn't likely to welcome visitors poking around his land, especially visitors with an interest in those skulls. Vernon decided he'd approach Silas straight on, maybe propose a partnership to excavate and sell the remaining skulls, split the profits down the middle. That seemed the honest way to handle it. The journey took 2 full days through terrain that grew progressively rougher. Vernon followed game trails and old logging roads, making camp the first night in a sheltered hollow where a spring offered fresh water. The weather held clear but cold, the kind of sharp autumn air that coaxed the mountains into brilliant displays of red and gold. On the 2nd afternoon, he reached the general area where Silas's farm was supposed to be, but finding the exact location proved harder than anticipated. The valleys in that stretch of country all looked alike, and the sparse population meant there were few landmarks to navigate by. Vernon was beginning to think he'd have to turn around and get better directions when Stryker abruptly stopped on the trail, his whole body going rigid in that particular way that meant he'd caught the scent of something unusual. Vernon moved up carefully, his hand instinctively finding his rifle. But what Stryker had found wasn't game or predator. It was a marker of sorts, a cairn of stacked stones beside the trail with what looked like a strip of cloth, tied to a stick planted among the rocks. The cloth was faded and worn, but Vernon could make out what might once have been symbols or letters painted on it, too weathered now to read clearly. He studied the cairn for several minutes, uncertain what to make of it. Trail markers weren't unusual in the mountains, but they typically indicated property lines or the location of springs. This one felt different somehow, less like a waypoint and more like a warning. Stryker circled the cairn nervously, whining low in his throat, which was out of character for an otherwise fearless dog. Vernon was about to move on when he noticed something else. More cairns were visible further up the trail, spaced at uneven intervals, each decorated with similar weathered cloth markers. Following the cairns led Vernon off the main trail and into a narrow valley he hadn't known was there. The valley ran roughly north to south, hemmed in on both sides by steep ridges, with a small creek winding down through its center. The trees here were old growth, massive oaks and chestnuts that must have somehow escaped the loggers' saws, their canopy so dense that the forest floor lay in near permanent shadow even in the middle of the afternoon. Vernon noticed that the undergrowth was surprisingly thin, giving the place an oddly manicured quality, as if someone had deliberately cleared away the smaller plants and saplings. About half a mile into the valley, Vernon found what remained of Silas Cornett's farm. He says remained because it was plain that no one had lived there in quite some time. The cabin stood in a clearing beside the creek, its walls still intact, but its door hanging open on broken hinges. The windows were empty of glass, and several roof shingles had been torn away, leaving gaps that would let in the rain. A barn or storage shed had partially collapsed, its timbers rotting beneath a thick cover of vines. What had once been a kitchen garden was swallowed by weeds and volunteer trees. The whole place carried the abandoned, melancholy air of a homestead surrendered back to the forest. Vernon called out several times, but only his echo came back. He dismounted and approached the cabin carefully, Stryker pressing close against his leg in a way that made clear the dog was deeply uneasy. Inside, the cabin was stripped bare except for a few broken pieces of furniture and some rusted tools. Animals had clearly taken up residence. Raccoons scat in one corner, bird nests tucked into the rafters. But what struck Vernon most forcefully was the walls. They were covered in writing. Not everywhere, but concentrated around the door and windows particularly. Someone had used what appeared to be charcoal or burnt wood to write directly on the log walls, filling every available surface with cramped, frantic handwriting. Vernon couldn't make out most of it. The light was too dim and the writing too small and disorganized, but certain phrases jumped out, repeated again and again. They were already here. The ground remembers. Not animal. Counting wrong. They watch when we sleep. He stood there a long moment, reading what he could, trying to piece together some meaning. The writing had the quality of someone trying urgently to document something, or trying to convince themselves of something they didn't want to accept. The same sentences appeared over and over in places, as if the writer was working through an idea or pushing back against a thought that kept returning uninvited. Vernon had watched men lose their minds in these mountains before. The isolation could do that, especially to people who hadn't grown up with it. He assumed Silas Cornett had suffered some kind of breakdown, abandoned the farm, and was probably living with relatives or had relocated to town. But that still didn't account for the skulls, or for why a doctor would offer $50 for one. Vernon left the cabin and began searching the clearing and the surrounding forest. If Silas had found the skulls while clearing land, There had to be evidence of digging somewhere nearby. It took nearly an hour of searching before he found it. A stretch of ground roughly 200 yards from the cabin on a slight rise above the creek, where someone had clearly been excavating. The site was larger than Vernon had expected, maybe 30 feet across, with several pits of varying depths. Most had been filled back in, either deliberately or by erosion, but one remained partially open. Vernon approached the open pit with care. It was roughly circular, about 6 feet across and 4 feet deep, its walls bearing the clear marks of having been dug by hand, the tool impressions still legible in the clay soil. At the bottom of the pit, partially exposed, Vernon could see what had drawn him all this way. Bones, and not just a few, but many jumbled together in what did indeed look like some kind of mass burial. And among the bones, even from where he stood, Vernon could make out the unmistakable curve of skulls. He'd brought a shovel and a pick, thinking he might need them. Now he climbed down into the pit and began carefully clearing soil away from the bones. The work was slow and deliberate. Vernon had no training in excavation or archaeology, but he had enough sense to recognize that these remains were old, very old, and likely fragile. He worked as the afternoon light began to soften, finally pulling free his first complete skull, just as the sun touched the western ridge. What he held made him understand immediately why a doctor would pay $50. The skull was roughly the size of a large dog's, perhaps slightly bigger, but its structure was unlike anything Vernon had ever encountered. The cranium was elongated in a way that seemed wrong, the eye sockets positioned too far forward and angled in a manner that suggested binocular vision, like a predator, but larger and more prominent than any predator skull he'd seen. The jaw was heavy and built for powerful biting, with teeth still partially embedded in the bone. But it was the overall shape that disturbed him most. It implied intelligence somehow, a brain cavity that seemed too large, too developed for a simple animal. Vernon sat at the edge of the pit as darkness gathered, turning the skull slowly in his hands, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he understood about the natural world. He'd hunted and trapped for 20 years. He'd examined bear skulls and wolf skulls, panther skulls and elk skulls, skulls from every creature those mountains harbored. This was none of those things. The proportions were wrong. The entire structure was wrong. Had he found it in isolation, he might have written it off as a deformity or a mutation. But the pit was full of similar skulls, dozens of them by the look of it, all sharing the same unsettling characteristics. And speaking of which, have you ever come across something that science couldn't quite account for? Something that made you question what you thought was real? Drop a comment and tell me about it. I genuinely want to know what strange things you've encountered. Vernon made camp near the dig site that night, built a fire, and tried to convince himself that what he'd found was valuable rather than disturbing. He laid the skull beside his bedroll, studying it by firelight, trying to picture what kind of creature it had once belonged to. The bone was mineralized, nearly petrified, which suggested enormous age. How long would remains need to lie in the earth to turn to stone like this? Hundreds of years. Thousands. He had no way of knowing, but it reinforced his sense that these were ancient things from a time before written history, perhaps even before any human presence in these mountains. Stryker refused to sleep anywhere near the skull. The dog paced the perimeter of Vernon's camp in repeated circuits, whining and restless, until Vernon finally lost patience and threw a stick at him, ordering him to settle. Even then, Stryker kept his distance, lying just beyond the firelight with his eyes locked on the skull and a low growl rolling periodically in his chest. Vernon slept badly that night, troubled by dreams he couldn't quite hold onto upon waking. He was up before dawn, stiff and cold, and resumed his excavation as soon as there was enough light to work by. Over the next 3 days, he extracted 17 more skulls from the pit along with numerous other bones he couldn't easily place. Some were clearly leg bones or ribs, but others had unusual structures or joints that didn't match his limited anatomical knowledge. He packed the skulls carefully in canvas sacks padded with moss and leaves, handling them as the valuable commodities he hoped they would become. On the 4th day, Vernon decided he had enough. 18 skulls should be more than sufficient to make his fortune, if he could locate the right buyers. He'd noticed that the deeper he dug, the more agitated Stryker became, until the dog was spending most of his time on the far side of the clearing, refusing to come anywhere near the pit. Vernon himself had begun experiencing strange sensations while working, waves of profound unease that would roll over him without any apparent cause, a persistent feeling of being watched, even when he could see clearly that he was alone, and an intermittent ringing in his ears that appeared and vanished without pattern. He told himself these were simply the effects of exhaustion and isolation, the natural byproduct of days of hard labor in a lonely valley. But some part of him recognized that something about this place felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't only the abandoned farm, or the strange writing in the cabin, or even the inexplicable skulls. It was something in the air itself, a quality of wrongness that seemed to deepen with every additional hour he spent there. Vernon loaded his mule with the sacks of skulls and prepared to leave. Before departing, he walked back to the cabin one more time, pulled by a compulsion he didn't fully understand. In the growing morning light, the wall writing was easier to read, and he spent several minutes working through Silas Cornett's frantic records, trying to piece together what had happened to the man. One passage, written in larger letters near the door, held his attention. Found them. April 19th, started digging. April 22nd, first dream. April 23rd. They are not pleased we disturbed them. They show me things when I close my eyes. Things that were here before. Things that might come back. The ground remembers even if we have forgotten. We were never alone in these mountains. Vernon copied this passage into his notebook, though he couldn't fully explain why he felt the need to preserve it. Then he left the valley, following the cairns back to the main trail, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and that unsettling place. Stryker trotted ahead with obvious relief, no longer showing the nervous behavior that had marked the past several days. The journey back to Harlan Station took 3 days. Vernon traveled with care, fully aware that he was carrying something both valuable and fragile. He'd wrapped each skull individually and padded them as thoroughly as he could manage, but the mountain trails were rough, and several times he had to dismount and lead his mule through particularly treacherous sections to protect the cargo. During this return trip, Vernon began to notice something strange. His dreams, which had always been fragmentary and forgettable, had taken on a vivid, almost hallucinatory quality. He would find himself back in the valley, where he'd found the skulls, but the valley as it had existed in some impossibly distant past. In these dreams, the forest looked different, the trees smaller and more widely spaced, and there were beings there. Creatures moving through the shadows on 4 legs, but with a gait that seemed too deliberate, too coordinated to be merely animal. He would wake from these dreams with his heart hammering and a lingering sense that he had been shown something he was not meant to see. He tried to dismiss them as the products of exhaustion and the stress of his expedition, but they continued every night, becoming more detailed and more disturbing. In one particularly vivid dream, he stood in the center of the valley at night, while the beings he'd glimpsed before emerged from the tree line in scores, perhaps hundreds, surrounding him in a vast and silent circle. They didn't advance or threaten, just watched, their eyes catching the moonlight like a cat's, but with something else behind that reflection, some quality of intelligence or awareness that made his blood run cold even in sleep. Vernon reached Harlan Station on an overcast afternoon in early November. The town was small even by mountain standards, barely 36 buildings clustered around a muddy main street, but it had a telegraph office and a railway depot, which made it the commercial center for miles around. His first stop was the general store, where he bought supplies and made casual inquiries about who might be interested in unusual animal specimens. The storekeeper, a man named Rufus Kilgore, whom Vernon had known for years, suggested he reach out to a professor at a college in Lexington, who sometimes purchased fossils and native artifacts. Vernon sent a telegram from the railway office that same afternoon, wording his message carefully to suggest he had located significant paleontological specimens, without being too specific about their nature or number. He signed his name and the name of the town, then settled in to wait. Telegrams were expensive, but Vernon reasoned that if these skulls were worth what he hoped, the cost would be negligible by comparison. The telegraph operator, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, asked Vernon what kind of specimens he'd found. But Vernon deflected the question, saying only that they were fossils of an unknown species. While waiting for a reply, Vernon took a room at the town's only boarding house, a 2-story structure run by a widow named Cora Sykes. The room was small but clean, with a real mattress and a window looking out over the street. Vernon stored his sacks of skulls beneath the bed, checking on them periodically to make sure they remained undisturbed. That first night in town he slept better than he had in days, deep and dreamless, and woke feeling more like himself than he had since leaving the valley. The reply to his telegram arrived 3 days later. Professor Augustus Whitfield of Central University in Lexington expressed strong interest in Vernon's discovery and indicated he would travel to Harlan Station personally to examine the specimens. He provided an arrival date, approximately 1 week out, and asked Vernon to keep the discovery confidential until they could meet. Vernon read the telegram several times, barely able to believe his luck. A professor traveling all the way from Lexington meant the skulls were genuinely significant, perhaps even more valuable than he had dared to imagine. During the week he spent waiting for Professor Whitfield, Vernon made the error of sharing his good fortune with several people in town. He didn't reveal specifics about what he'd found, but he mentioned to Rufus Kilgore and a few others that he'd made a significant discovery that might bring him substantial money. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, that kind of news moved fast. Within 2 days, Vernon found himself the subject of considerable attention and speculation. People who had scarcely acknowledged him before suddenly wanted to buy him drinks or draw him into conversation, fishing for details about his find. One evening, Vernon was approached in the boarding house dining room by a man he'd never seen before. The stranger was well dressed by mountain standards, wearing a suit that had seen better days, but still carried an air of professional respectability. He introduced himself as Hadley Morris, a representative for a museum in Cincinnati. Morris said he'd heard through certain channels that Vernon had made an interesting paleontological discovery, and that his institution would be very interested in acquiring any significant specimens. He suggested they step outside to discuss terms in private. Vernon's instincts told him something was off about Morris. The man's story was plausible enough, but there was something in his manner, an eagerness barely held in check beneath a veneer of professional courtesy, that put Vernon on guard. He told Morris politely, but firmly, that he had already made arrangements to show his specimens to a professor from Lexington, and would not be entertaining other offers until after that meeting. Morris's expression flickered with something that might have been irritation before smoothing back into professional neutrality. He handed Vernon a calling card and urged him to make contact if his current arrangement fell through, then left without further conversation. Vernon mentioned the encounter to Cora Sykes later that evening, and the widow's reaction surprised him. She became visibly unsettled, warning Vernon that other men like Morris had been passing through town in recent weeks, strangers asking questions about fossils and old bones, offering money for information. Cora said she'd gotten a bad feeling about the whole business, that it reminded her of when the lumber companies had first come through, handing local people pennies for timber rights that were worth fortunes. She urged Vernon to be careful about who he trusted. That night, Vernon's dreams came back. He was standing at the edge of the pit in the valley. But in the dream the pit was far larger, deep enough that he couldn't see the bottom, and something was climbing out of it, slowly and deliberately, hauling itself up from the darkness using limbs that bent in ways that made his eyes hurt to follow. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He could only stand there, frozen, as the thing climbed steadily closer, close enough that he could hear the scrape of its claws on stone, the rasp of its breath, close enough that he could almost make out its face. Then he woke gasping, his clothes soaked through despite the November chill. Vernon got out of bed and lit the lamp, needing light and movement to loosen the nightmare's grip. He pulled one of the skulls out from under the bed and examined it by lamplight, as if seeing it clearly might drain away some of the dream's power. The bone felt cold in his hands, colder than the room temperature would explain. As he turned it, studying the eye sockets and the peculiar jaw structure, he found himself wondering what these creatures had truly been, not just anatomically, but in a deeper sense. Had they been predators? Had they hunted in packs? Had they possessed any form of real intelligence? And perhaps most disturbingly, what had killed them all and brought them together in that valley? Professor Whitfield arrived on schedule, stepping off the train on a gray afternoon with the look of a man not accustomed to rural travel. He appeared to be in his early 60s, tall and slightly stooped, with wild gray hair and spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He wore a city suit that looked thoroughly out of place against the backdrop of Harlan Station's muddy streets, and he carried a leather satchel that appeared heavy with books or papers. Vernon met him at the station and helped arrange transport of his luggage to the boarding house. Over supper that evening, Whitfield laid out his background and credentials. He was a professor of natural history with a particular focus on paleontology, especially fossil mammals of the Tertiary period. He'd published papers in several scientific journals and had corresponded with leading researchers in both Europe and America. He spoke with the careful precision of an academic, selecting his words deliberately, occasionally pausing mid-sentence to clarify or refine a point. Vernon found himself liking the man despite his initial skepticism about city folk. After the meal, Vernon brought Whitfield to his room to examine the specimens. He'd laid out 6 of the skulls on a sheet spread across the floor, selecting what he considered the best preserved examples. Whitfield's reaction upon seeing them was immediate and profound. He dropped to his knees beside the skulls, his professional composure cracking to reveal genuine astonishment. He lifted the nearest one with hands that trembled slightly, turning it in the lamplight, examining every detail with an intensity that bordered on reverence. For several minutes, Whitfield said nothing at all. He simply moved from skull to skull, occasionally pulling a magnifying glass from his satchel to inspect particular features more closely. Vernon watched this examination with growing confidence. Whatever these skulls were, they were clearly significant enough to leave a learned professor utterly speechless. Finally, Whitfield looked up at Vernon with an expression that mingled excitement with something that might have been fear. The professor's first questions were all about the excavation site. He wanted everything: the exact location, the depth of burial, any associated materials, the stratigraphic context, the soil composition. Vernon did his best to answer, though he had to admit his lack of any scientific method in extracting the specimens. Whitfield winced at Vernon's description of his excavation technique, but seemed to accept that a rough frontiersman couldn't be expected to follow archaeological protocols. What mattered were the specimens themselves, and they were extraordinary. Whitfield explained that the skulls resembled nothing currently documented in the known fossil record of North American mammals. The cranial capacity implied intelligence well beyond that of typical predators. The dental structure suggested an omnivorous diet, capable of processing both meat and plant material. The positioning of the eye sockets indicated excellent binocular vision, but most intriguing was the overall morphology, which hinted at a creature that may have been partly arboreal, adapted for both ground, level movement and climbing. Whitfield estimated the complete animal would have been perhaps 4 to 5 feet in length, powerfully built, probably weighing somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds. Vernon asked the obvious question: what were they? Whitfield removed his spectacles and cleaned them, a gesture Vernon would come to recognize as the professor's habit when wrestling with difficult thoughts. He said honestly that he didn't know. The skulls displayed characteristics of several different mammalian lineages without fitting comfortably into any of them. If they were genuine fossils, and preliminary examination strongly suggested they were, then they represented either an unknown branch of mammalian evolution, or possibly evidence of convergent evolution producing forms similar to known species through entirely independent pathways. Either possibility would be scientifically extraordinary. But then Whitfield added something that made Vernon's sense of triumph waver slightly. The professor said the skulls troubled him for reasons that went beyond taxonomy. The mineralization pattern was unusual, suggesting burial under very specific soil conditions. The sheer number of individuals concentrated in what Vernon described as a single deposit was unprecedented for any terrestrial mammal he was aware of. And there was something about the proportions, the cranial development in particular, that struck him as almost purposeful, as if these creatures had been. And here Whitfield paused, clearly uncomfortable with where his own thinking was leading, as if these creatures had been developing toward something. Vernon didn't fully understand what the professor meant by that last remark, but he didn't press for clarification. Instead, he asked about value. What would institutions pay for specimens like these? Whitfield's answer was both encouraging and complicated. The skulls themselves were priceless from a scientific standpoint, each one a unique window into an unknown chapter of natural history. But commercial value depended on several factors: provenance, verification, competing claims, and the willingness of institutions to acquire specimens that might prove controversial. He offered Vernon $500 for the 6 skulls currently on display, with the condition that Vernon guide him back to the excavation site so they could properly document the find and extract additional specimens using scientific methods. $500 was more money than Vernon had ever held at one time, more than he'd earned in 5 years of trapping and hunting. He accepted immediately, and they shook hands on it. And since we're here, this story is being narrated by the fear behind you. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening to this on another channel, you should know they stole our content without permission. Please report it so we can protect our work. The following morning, Vernon and Professor Whitfield began preparations for the journey back to the valley. Whitfield had brought his own tools, proper archaeological implements, including small brushes and marking stakes, along with a camera for documentation. Vernon arranged pack horses and supplies for what they estimated would be a 2-week expedition. Word of their planned trip spread quickly through town, and Vernon noticed that several people seemed unusually curious about their destination. Hadley Morris appeared at the boarding house the evening before their departure and made one final attempt to purchase the specimens, but Whitfield politely declined on Vernon's behalf. They left Harlan Station on a cold November morning under low clouds that promised snow. The journey to the valley took 3 days, slightly longer than Vernon's original trip, on account of Whitfield's limited experience with mountain travel and the need to move carefully with the scientific equipment. During those 3 days on the trail, Vernon found himself telling Whitfield about the stranger aspects of his discovery, the abandoned farm, the writing on the cabin walls, Silas Cornett's disappearance, the unsettling dreams. Whitfield listened to these details with an expression that grew increasingly thoughtful. He mentioned that other paleontological sites had been associated with reports of unusual phenomena, though he was careful to frame these as psychological effects rather than anything supernatural. The isolation of remote dig sites, combined with long hours of demanding physical labor, could produce a range of mental disturbances. The writing Vernon had described sounded like the product of someone experiencing a dissociative episode, or possibly the early stages of a psychotic break. The dreams were most likely Vernon's subconscious processing the unusual nature of his find. Vernon wanted to accept the professor's rational explanations, but some part of him still held the memory of that valley, the pervasive sense of wrongness that had saturated everything there, and wondered whether rationality alone was adequate to explain what he'd experienced. They reached the valley on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The weather had grown colder, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the ridge lines with white. Vernon led them past the cairns and into the narrow valley, and even in daylight, even with company, he felt that same creeping unease he'd carried during his first visit. Whitfield seemed to pick up on the atmosphere as well, commenting on how quiet the valley was, how few birds they'd seen or heard since entering it. The abandoned farm looked exactly as Vernon had left it. They made camp in the clearing near the cabin, Whitfield insisting on examining the structure before darkness settled in. Vernon watched as the professor worked through the wall writing, transcribing passages into his notebook with the meticulous care of a scholar documenting primary sources. Whitfield's expression as he read was difficult to interpret, somewhere between scientific fascination and genuine unease. That evening, seated by their campfire over a simple supper, Whitfield asked Vernon whether he'd noticed anything unusual about the cairns they'd passed on the way in. Vernon admitted he'd found them strange, but hadn't given them much thought beyond using them as trail markers. Whitfield said he'd examined several of them closely during their journey, and what he'd found was troubling. The stones in each cairn had been deliberately selected and arranged, he believed, not simply stacked at random. And the cloth markers, weathered as they were, bore traces of symbols that might be writing, though not in any alphabet Whitfield recognized. The professor's theory was that the cairns were very old, possibly centuries old, and represented some form of warning or boundary marker. The valley, he suggested, may have been considered taboo or forbidden by earlier inhabitants of the region, possibly indigenous peoples who had lived there before European settlement. The mass burial of the strange creatures Vernon had found could be evidence of some kind of catastrophic die-off that had been witnessed and preserved in local traditions, passed down through generations until those traditions finally faded and were forgotten. Vernon asked whether that suggested the skulls were relatively recent, rather than truly ancient. Whitfield shook his head. The mineralization he'd observed indicated the bones were very old indeed, thousands of years at minimum. But that didn't rule out the possibility that knowledge of their existence had been carried forward through oral tradition, or that the burial site itself had been marked and deliberately avoided by successive cultures over many generations. They began excavation work the following morning. Whitfield's approach was methodical and time-consuming, the polar opposite of Vernon's rough digging. The professor divided the site into a grid, documenting the position of every find carefully before removing anything. He photographed extensively, though the flat gray weather made this challenging. Vernon assisted as best he could, following Whitfield's instructions and picking up the basics of proper excavation technique as they went. Over the next 4 days, they extracted 23 more skulls and several dozen additional bones. Whitfield's excitement grew with each discovery, but so did his unease. He began identifying patterns in how the remains were arranged. The skulls weren't randomly scattered, as one might expect from a natural die-off or predator cache. They appeared to have been positioned deliberately, arranged in what looked like concentric circles or spirals, though erosion and time had disrupted the original configuration. Whitfield suggested this pointed toward intentional burial, possibly ritualistic in nature. But who would have buried them, and to what end? On the 5th day, they made a discovery that fundamentally altered Whitfield's understanding of what they were dealing with. While carefully excavating the southeastern section of the site, the professor uncovered something that wasn't bone. It was stone, but clearly worked stone, shaped by tools or hands into a form that was unmistakably artificial. The object was roughly triangular, about the size of Vernon's palm, with edges that had been deliberately sharpened or flaked. It looked, Vernon thought, something like a tool or weapon. Similar to the arrowheads and stone implements he'd occasionally turned up in these mountains, artifacts left behind by the indigenous people who'd lived here before displacement. Except the size was wrong, and the proportions were wrong. This stone tool had plainly been fashioned for a hand considerably larger than any human's, with fingers arranged differently, the grip suggesting something between human dexterity and the structure of an animal's paw. Whitfield sat on the edge of the excavation pit, holding the stone tool and staring at it in silence. After a long pause, the professor spoke quietly, almost as if talking to himself rather than to Vernon. He said they needed to consider a possibility that was, from a scientific standpoint, almost inconceivable. What if the creatures they'd found weren't simply unusual mammals? What if they'd been tool users? What if they'd possessed some level of intelligence sufficient to create implements and perhaps even burial rituals? Vernon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. He thought about the recurring dreams, the sense of being observed, the writing on the cabin walls. He asked Whitfield what it would mean if the creatures had been intelligent. The professor removed his spectacles and cleaned them, that familiar gesture. He said the implications would be profound and deeply troubling. It would mean humanity hadn't been alone in its evolutionary march toward intelligence. It would mean that other thinking beings had existed, possibly for thousands or millions of years, and had ultimately failed, died out, leaving behind nothing but buried bones and faded warnings. But more troubling still, Whitfield added, was the question of what had killed them all. A species intelligent enough to create tools and observe burial rites wouldn't disappear easily. It would adapt, survive, persist. Whatever had wiped them out must have been catastrophic, possibly environmental change or disease, possibly something worse. That night, both Vernon and Whitfield experienced the dreams. They compared accounts over breakfast the following morning and found their nighttime visions had been remarkably similar. Both had dreamed of the valley, as it had been in some distant past, populated by the creatures whose bones they were excavating. Both had watched these beings moving through the forest with unmistakable purpose and organization, hunting in coordinated groups, using tools, communicating through sounds that were almost but not quite language. And both had glimpsed something else in their dreams, something that remained frustratingly indistinct, a presence or force that the creatures feared, something that had driven them to whatever desperate actions had culminated in their mass death and burial. Whitfield suggested they pause excavations for a day and spend the time exploring the surrounding valley more thoroughly. Vernon agreed, partly out of genuine curiosity, but mostly because he needed a break from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the dig site. They spent that day walking the ridge lines and following the creek, looking for additional sites or artifacts. What they found was more unsettling than informative. At multiple locations throughout the valley, they discovered evidence of additional burial sites, smaller than the main pit, but clearly related. Some contained only a handful of individuals, others a dozen or more. All showed the same careful arrangement, the same deliberate positioning of remains. Whitfield's rough estimate suggested there might be upwards of 300 individuals buried throughout the valley, possibly more. He asked Vernon a question that had clearly been weighing on him. In all his years working these mountains, had Vernon ever encountered anything that matched what these skulls implied? Living creatures, he meant, not fossils. Vernon thought carefully before answering. He'd seen plenty of strange things in the wilderness, come across animals he couldn't quite identify, heard sounds in the night that resisted explanation, but nothing that aligned with these skulls, nothing combining that particular size and apparent intelligence. Whatever these creatures had been, they were gone now, extinct, probably for thousands of years. Whitfield seemed both relieved and faintly disappointed by the answer. On their 8th day in the valley, something happened that neither man could explain away easily. They were working at the main excavation site in the late afternoon when Stryker, who had been lying quietly nearby, suddenly leapt to his feet and began barking frantically toward the tree line. Vernon had never heard the dog make sounds quite like this. A combination of raw fear and aggression that raised the hair on his own neck. Both men stopped working and looked in the direction Stryker was fixed on. The forest was still and quiet, the trees standing bare in their late autumn nakedness against a gray sky. Vernon could see nothing unusual, no movement, no sign of any animal or person. Yet Stryker kept barking, his body rigid, his attention locked on something in the shadows between the trees. Then, slowly and deliberately, the dog began backing away, still barking but clearly unwilling to stand his ground against whatever he was perceiving. Whitfield asked quietly what Vernon thought was out there. Vernon didn't know. He picked up his rifle and moved toward the tree line, calling out a warning to any person who might be concealed there, making enough noise to drive off any bear or panther. He reached the edge of the forest and peered into the shadowed interior, his finger resting on the trigger. Nothing. No tracks in the soft earth. No broken branches. No sign that anything had been present at all. But the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Vernon stood at the forest edge for several minutes, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that might betray a presence. The silence was absolute, broken only by Stryker's continued agitated barking from behind him. He finally turned back and told Whitfield they should pack it in for the day and head back to camp. The professor didn't argue. That evening they talked through what had happened. Whitfield tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Stryker had caught the scent of a predator, something large enough to give even a brave dog reason to hesitate. Mountain lions still ranged these ridges occasionally, and a big cat could unsettle even a fearless dog. But Vernon had hunted mountain lions, and he knew exactly how Stryker reacted to big cats. This had been entirely different. The dog hadn't been warning off a predator. He had been genuinely terrified. Vernon mentioned the feeling of being watched, and Whitfield admitted he'd felt it too. Not just during the episode with Stryker, but intermittently throughout their time in the valley. The professor offered a psychological explanation: the human tendency to project consciousness onto ambiguous situations, our evolutionary heritage driving us to perceive predators and threats even where none exist. But his explanation sounded unconvincing even to himself, and he eventually let it trail off into silence. They decided to spend 2 more days excavating and then return to Harlan Station with their specimens. Whitfield said he had more than enough material for several papers, possibly even a monograph. The discovery would establish his reputation as one of the foremost paleontologists in America. But Vernon noticed the professor's enthusiasm had been gradually replaced, since their arrival in the valley, by an anxiety that seemed to deepen a little more each day. The final 2 days of excavation passed without major incident, though both men remained on edge, flinching at unexpected sounds and constantly checking the tree line for movement. They extracted a few more skulls and several remarkably well-preserved limb bones that Whitfield said would be essential for reconstructing how these creatures had moved and lived. On their last evening in the valley, they carefully packed all the specimens, wrapping each in cloth and padding them with moss and pine needles for the journey out. Vernon suggested they burn the cabin before leaving. He couldn't fully put into words why it felt necessary, but the thought of that structure standing empty with its frantic wall writing seemed wrong somehow, as if it might draw other people to this place, people who would be better off staying away. Whitfield initially objected on the grounds of preserving historical evidence, but Vernon's practical argument carried the day. The cabin was already deteriorating, and the wall writing would likely be illegible within a few more years regardless. Better to end it cleanly. They soaked the interior with lamp oil and set it alight just before dawn on their day of departure. The structure caught quickly, the dry timber burning with an almost eager intensity. Vernon and Whitfield stood watching as the flames consumed the cabin, and with it Silas Cornett's desperate effort to document whatever he had experienced there. As the roof buckled and collapsed in a shower of sparks, Vernon felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully recognized until it lifted. They left the valley as the sun came up, following the cairns back to the main trail. Neither man looked back. The return to Harlan Station took 4 days, the need to move carefully with their fragile cargo slowing their progress. The weather had turned sharper, and they had to navigate several sections of iced over trail with care. But the specimens made it through intact, and they arrived back in town on a gray late November afternoon to find that word of their discovery had traveled far further than Vernon had anticipated. 3 more strangers were waiting in town, each claiming to represent a different museum or university, all eager to examine and potentially purchase specimens. Whitfield dealt with them politely but firmly, explaining that the specimens were already committed to Central University pending formal evaluation and documentation. One of the strangers, a man who introduced himself as representing the Smithsonian Institution, grew quite aggressive when Whitfield refused, even to let him view the skulls, invoking legal threats and vague claims about federal jurisdiction over fossil discoveries. Vernon found the whole situation exhausting and vaguely threatening. He'd envisioned a straightforward transaction: trade the skulls for money, use that money to build a better life. Instead, he'd become entangled in what appeared to be fierce institutional competition, with himself as the unwitting prize. He told Whitfield plainly that he just wanted to complete their deal and put the whole business behind him. The professor arranged immediate transport of the specimens to Lexington, accompanying them personally on the train to ensure their safety. Before departing, he handed Vernon $250 in cash as a down payment, promising the remainder once the university had formally accepted and cataloged the specimens. He also had Vernon sign several documents, affirming the provenance of the fossils and granting Central University first rights to any additional discoveries from the site. Vernon watched the train carry Professor Whitfield and the skulls away with mixed feelings. Relief, certainly, to be free of the responsibility and the attention they had attracted, but also a strange sense of loss, as if he'd parted with something that had quietly grown significant to him over the past weeks. Not the skulls themselves exactly, but what they represented: evidence that the world was stranger and more mysterious than he had ever imagined. He used some of the money to settle his bill at the boarding house and purchase supplies, then rode home to his cabin near the Clover Fork. It felt good to be back, surrounded by familiar things and simple routines. Stryker seemed equally glad to be home, immediately returning to his normal self after weeks of anxiety and strange behavior. Vernon tried to settle back into his old life, running his trap lines, hunting for winter meat, attending to the things around his property that needed fixing. But the dreams persisted, not every night, but often enough that he came to dread sleep. He would find himself back in the valley, sometimes during the excavation, sometimes earlier, watching the creatures themselves going about their lives in some lost prehistoric world. The dreams had a vividness that ordinary dreams lacked, and Vernon frequently woke with the unsettling conviction that he hadn't been dreaming at all, but remembering, though that made no sense, because these events had unfolded thousands of years before he was born. In one particularly disturbing dream, Vernon witnessed the creatures' final days. He watched as they abandoned their scattered family groups and converged on the valley, driven by some imperative he couldn't comprehend. He saw them dig the pits and arrange themselves within those pits in the careful spiral patterns Whitfield had documented, and he saw that they did this willingly, deliberately, with what could only be described as resignation, or perhaps acceptance. They were entombing themselves alive, and they did so with the quiet efficiency of beings following a plan or fulfilling some purpose. But why? What could drive an entire species to collective self-burial? Vernon woke from this dream with tears on his face, though he couldn't explain his emotional response. Why should he grieve for creatures that had died untold millennia ago? And yet he did, with an intensity that bypassed rational thought entirely and struck at something deeper and more primal. December faded into January. Vernon received a letter from Professor Whitfield describing the sensation the specimens had caused in academic circles. The skulls were unlike anything in the known fossil record, and the discovery was being celebrated as one of the most significant paleontological finds of the decade. Whitfield had presented preliminary findings to the American Association for the Advancement of Science and had been invited to speak at institutions across the country. He noted, almost as an aside, that he'd been experiencing peculiar dreams since returning to Lexington. Vivid nightmares centered on the valley and the creatures they'd excavated, but he attributed these to stress and overwork. The letter included the remaining $250 Whitfield had promised, bringing Vernon's total payment to $500 as agreed. It also contained an offer. Would Vernon be willing to guide another expedition to the valley in spring? Whitfield wanted to conduct a thorough excavation, properly map and document the entire site, and possibly search for additional burial locations. The university was prepared to fund such an expedition generously and would compensate Vernon well for his services as guide and general assistant. Vernon held that letter for several days before he could bring himself to answer it. Part of him wanted nothing more to do with the valley or those skulls. Part of him felt he'd already taken too much, disturbed something that was better left alone. But another part, the pragmatic frontiersman who'd spent his life wrestling survival from these unforgiving mountains, recognized that 500 was only the beginning. If he managed this carefully, he could earn enough to never again worry about hard winters or failed hunts. He wrote back to Whitfield accepting the offer for a spring expedition. January gave way to February, and Vernon began noticing changes in himself that he found troubling. He had always been comfortable with solitude, preferring his own company to the social demands of town life. But now he found isolation oppressive, as if the silence of his cabin contained something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. He began making more frequent trips to Harlan Station, seeking out the company of other people, even when he had little to say to them. He would catch himself scanning tree lines and shadows, looking for movement that was never there, fighting a persistent sense of being observed. Stryker had changed too. The dog had become nervous and reactive, barking at nothing, refusing to enter parts of the forest he had previously crossed without hesitation. Several times Vernon woke in the night to find Stryker standing at the cabin door, growling quietly, his attention fixed on something outside. Vernon would rise and look out, see only darkness and trees, but the dog's agitation wouldn't subside for hours. In early March, Vernon received disturbing news from town. Hadley Morris, the supposed museum representative who had tried to purchase the skulls, had been found dead in a rooming house in Middlesbrough, about 30 miles southwest. The circumstances were strange enough to warrant investigation. Morris had apparently locked himself in his room and refused to come out for several days. Other boarders reported hearing him talking to himself, holding what sounded like arguments with invisible parties. When the landlady finally forced the door open, she found Morris dead of what the doctor ruled as heart failure, though the man had been young and apparently in excellent health. What made the story particularly disturbing was the state of the room. Morris had covered every available surface with writing, using whatever he could lay hands on: pencils, charcoal, his own blood. The writing was fragmentary and largely illegible, but several phrases had been clear enough for witnesses to recall and repeat. They don't want us to know. The valley remembers. Buried themselves, but not gone, watching from beneath. Vernon felt ice settle in his stomach when he heard those phrases. They mirrored too closely the writing he'd found in Silas Cornett's abandoned cabin. The same language, the same imagery. He asked whether anyone knew what Morris had been doing in Middlesbrough, why he'd been in the area at all. The answer came from Rufus Kilgore at the general store. Morris had apparently been making inquiries about the location of Silas Cornett's farm, trying to find the valley where Vernon had made his discovery. Had Morris found the valley? Had he excavated more skulls? Vernon had no way of knowing, but the timing disturbed him. Morris had died in early March, meaning he'd likely been in the area and possibly exploring the valley during late February. Whatever he'd encountered there had been sufficient to drive him to madness and death within days or weeks. Vernon wrote to Whitfield, informing him of Morris's death and suggesting they might want to reconsider the spring expedition. Whitfield's reply came quickly and was longer than his previous letters, charged with a nervous energy Vernon could sense even through the written words. Yes, he had heard about Morris. Yes, it was deeply troubling. But Whitfield had also received other accounts, other stories that suggested something larger than simple coincidence or mental breakdown was at work. Two other researchers who had heard about the skulls and attempted to investigate the site independently had experienced what Whitfield carefully termed psychological disturbances. One had abandoned his planned excavation after a single night in the valley, fleeing back to civilization and claiming he had been assailed by sounds he couldn't describe and presences he couldn't see. The other had managed to extract several small bone fragments before retreating, and those fragments were now in Whitfield's possession at Central University. The professor had examined them and confirmed they matched the specimens Vernon had found. But he had also noticed something alarming. The bone fragments seemed to affect the people who handled them. Not everyone, and not consistently, but enough cases to establish a pattern. Several students who had worked with the specimens reported vivid nightmares. A laboratory assistant had experienced what she described as waking visions, seeing things that weren't present, hearing whispers in empty rooms. Whitfield himself admitted that his own dreams had intensified since the fragments arrived, growing so disturbing that he'd taken to avoiding sleep whenever he could manage it. The professor's letter then took a turn that surprised Vernon. Whitfield wrote that he had been researching the valley's history, attempting to find any records of indigenous peoples who might have lived there or considered it significant. What he'd turned up was fragmentary but suggestive. Multiple native groups appeared to have avoided the valley despite its strategic location and abundant resources. Accounts from early settlers mentioned that local indigenous peoples warned against entering certain valleys in the Cumberland region, places where the ground was described as bad or where the old ones slept. Whitfield had found references in frontier journals to unexplained disappearances of hunters and travelers who had entered unnamed valleys and never come back. Most intriguingly, Whitfield had uncovered a passage in a memoir written by a frontier preacher in the 1820s. The preacher described being brought by indigenous guides to a valley marked with stone cairns and cloth warnings. The guides had told him through a translator that the valley was forbidden because the first people were buried there. Not human ancestors, but beings that had walked the earth before humans, creatures that had possessed knowledge humans were never meant to hold, and who had chosen to enter themselves rather than allow that knowledge to be passed on. The preacher had dismissed this as pagan superstition, but Whitfield now wondered if it preserved genuine memory of the creatures whose bones Vernon had found. The letter concluded with Whitfield's decision. He intended to proceed with the spring expedition despite, or perhaps because of, the disturbing elements surrounding the discovery. As a man of science, he could not allow fear or superstition to block investigation of what might be the most significant paleontological find in history. He would understand if Vernon chose not to participate, but he hoped he would reconsider. They'd made the discovery together, and they should see it through together. Vernon read this letter multiple times, wrestling with his response. The money was undeniably tempting. Whitfield had mentioned a payment of $30,000 for Vernon's participation in the spring expedition, money that would resolve his immediate financial concerns and open up possibilities he had never seriously entertained before. But he also thought about Hadley Morris dying alone in a rooming house, covering the walls with warnings, written in his own blood. He thought about students experiencing psychotic breaks and drivers losing their minds and night watchmen dying of fright. The money wasn't worth that. Nothing was worth that. Have you ever been forced to choose between something you knew was dangerous and an opportunity that might never come your way again? What did you choose? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you would do in Vernon's position. In the end, the decision was made for him. In late March, he received a telegram from Whitfield that was brief and cryptic. Expedition cancelled. Do not return to Valley. Will explain in letter. Destroy all remaining specimens. Urgent. Vernon stood in the telegraph office, his hands trembling slightly as he read those words. He'd kept one skull, the first he'd ever excavated, as a personal keepsake of his discovery. It sat wrapped in canvas, in a wooden box beneath his bed, something he occasionally took out and examined when the mood struck him. Whitfield's full letter arrived 3 days later, and what it contained was enough to make Vernon seriously consider burning it unread. He forced himself through every word, and what the letter described was horrifying. Whitfield wrote that the situation at Central University had deteriorated rapidly. The specimens had been placed in a secure storage facility, while the professor prepared them for formal study and display. But strange things had begun happening in that facility and in the surrounding buildings. Staff reported hearing noises at night, scraping and movement from rooms that should have been vacant. Objects would be found displaced in the morning, shifted from where they'd been carefully positioned the evening before. Several employees had simply quit, saying the building felt wrong and they couldn't bear to work there any longer. Then people began dying. First, a night watchman assigned to guard the storage facility found dead at his post with no obvious cause, no signs of violence, just dead, with an expression frozen on his face that witnesses described as pure terror. The official finding was heart failure, but the man had been 42 years old and in excellent health. Then, a graduate student cataloging the specimens was discovered dead in his dormitory room. The same absence of obvious cause, the same expression of absolute dread locked permanently on his features. Whitfield had ordered the specimens moved to a more secure location, but the situation only worsened. People who spent time near the skulls or handled them began experiencing what the professor carefully described as reality distortions. They would see things that weren't there, hear voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize, feel presences watching them from corners and shadows. Several had to be institutionalized after complete psychotic breaks, babbling about beings that crawled up from beneath the earth, about knowledge that burned through the mind like acid, about choices made in the ancient past that still echoed forward into the present. The university administration had finally demanded that Whitfield remove the specimens from campus entirely. He'd arranged for them to be transported to a private facility, But during the transport, the wagon carrying the skulls had crashed under unexplained circumstances. The driver, a reliable man with 30 years of experience, claimed that something had caused the horses to panic, that he'd seen shapes keeping pace alongside the wagon in the darkness despite the animal's terror-driven speed. The wagon had overturned, and most of the specimens had been damaged or destroyed. The driver survived but lost his mind, ending up in the same institution as several of the students. Whitfield wrote that he had come to believe the creatures they'd found were not simply extinct animals. Whatever they had been, they'd possessed knowledge or capacities that persisted somehow even in death, seeping out from their physical remains like poison from a corrupted well. The professor didn't claim to understand the mechanism. It violated everything he understood about how the natural world functioned. But he could no longer dismiss the pattern of deaths and madness that had trailed the excavation and study of these specimens. His advice to Vernon was unambiguous. Destroy the remaining skull. Burn it, crush it, do whatever was necessary to ensure it was completely obliterated. Do not go back to the valley. Do not excavate any more remains. And most crucially, do not tell anyone where the valley was located. Let the site return to obscurity. Let the forest reclaim it. Let whatever was buried there stay buried. Vernon sat on his porch holding Whitfield's letter, watching the sun drop behind the western ridges. He thought about the skull beneath his bed, the dreams that had shadowed him for months, the relentless sense of being watched that had become his constant companion. Part of him wanted to follow Whitfield's advice without delay, retrieve the skull and put it in the fire. Be done with the thing and everything attached to it. But another part, one he neither fully understood nor trusted, resisted. The skull felt important somehow, like evidence of something fundamental about the nature of the world. Something that shouldn't simply be erased, because it was frightening. He went inside and retrieved the skull from its box, unwrapped the canvas, and held it in the lamplight. The bone felt cold in his hands, colder than the ambient temperature could explain. As he turned it slowly, studying the eye sockets and the strange jaw structure, something shifted in his perception. For just a moment, he could see them. Not a dream, not a memory, but a vision or a hallucination, or something for which he had no name at all. He saw the creatures as they had been, moving through the ancient forest with purpose and fluidity, their bodies shaped perfectly for life in those mountains. He watched them using tools, crude but effective, working stone and wood with hands that were neither human nor animal, but something occupying a point between the two. He saw them communicating, not through spoken language, but through sounds and gestures that carried complex meaning. And he saw their end. He saw them gathering in the valley, driven by knowledge they had somehow acquired, knowledge of something approaching, something that their intelligence had enabled them to perceive, but not to prevent. They understood they were finished, that their species had reached an evolutionary dead end, and they chose to go out on their own terms, rather than face whatever was coming. They dug their graves and arranged themselves within them in patterns that carried meaning and significance that Vernon could almost, but not quite grasp. But the most disturbing thing was what they had known. They had understood something about the nature of consciousness, about how awareness continued beyond the end of physical life, about how knowledge and memory could be encoded into the very structure of bone and transmitted to whoever disturbed those remains thousands of years later. They had known this would happen. They had known that eventually something else would evolve to fill the niche they were vacating, that those newcomers would find the burial sites, and that in disturbing the bones, they would receive the inheritance, the creatures had left behind. Knowledge, warning, and something more difficult to name. Vernon dropped the skull, gasping, his heart slamming against his ribs. The vision vanished instantly, leaving him standing alone in his cabin, with a piece of ancient bone on the floor, and the absolute certainty that he had just experienced something that should have been impossible. He had felt what they had felt, known what they had known, seen what they had seen. And what they had known was that consciousness was far more complex and durable than any human understanding had yet grasped. That intelligence was not unique to humanity, or even to physical existence, that the universe was inhabited by forms of awareness operating according to rules and within dimensions that human science had no framework to describe. They had also understood that certain knowledge was dangerous, that some truths were destructive to minds not yet prepared to receive them. That awareness itself could be a burden as much as a gift. Vernon understood now why they had buried themselves. They'd been trying to protect whatever came after them from inheriting knowledge that would break it. And they had failed, because the very act of attempting to conceal that knowledge had encoded it into their remains, had created a mechanism that would deliver it inevitably to whoever was curious, or greedy, or foolish enough to disturb their resting place. He gathered up the skull with shaking hands and carried it outside to his fire pit. He would burn it, as Whitfield had urged, reduce it to nothing. But even as he made this decision, he knew it wouldn't matter. The knowledge was already inside him, transferred in that moment of contact and vision. He could destroy the skull, but he could not destroy what he'd received from it. Vernon built the fire up until it burned white, hot, then placed the skull in the center of the flames. The mineralized bone resisted burning, turned nearly to stone by its long burial. But Vernon was patient. He fed the fire through the night, adding wood whenever the flames began to die, watching as the skull slowly blackened and cracked under the sustained heat. By morning, it had broken down to fragments and ash. Vernon scattered those remains across his property, mixing them into the soil and leaf litter, making certain they could never be gathered back together. Then he went inside and slept, for the first time in days, without dreaming. But the peace didn't hold. Over the following weeks, Vernon noticed changes in himself that frightened him more than the dreams ever had. His perception seemed to have shifted, as if he were simultaneously looking through multiple sets of eyes. When he looked out at the forest, he saw not only the present landscape, but echoes of how it had been in centuries and millennia past. When he listened to the wind, he heard patterns within it, meanings and messages that his conscious mind couldn't quite parse, but that some deeper layer of his awareness understood without difficulty. He tried to continue living normally, but normal had become unreachable. Hunting felt wrong now, because he could sense the fear and pain of animals too acutely, their consciousness as accessible to him as his own thoughts. Trips into Harlan Station became unbearable, because the press of human minds, their needs and anxieties and trivial concerns, overwhelmed him like a wall of sound. In April, Vernon received one final letter from Professor Whitfield. The professor wrote that he was resigning his position at Central University and withdrawing from academic life entirely. The events surrounding the excavation had persuaded him that some domains of knowledge were best left unexplored, some questions best left unanswered. He had destroyed all his notes and documentation related to the discovery, burned his photographs, and disposed of his specimens. He urged Vernon once more to stay away from the valley and to dissuade anyone who might express interest in the site. The letter ended with a strange admission. Whitfield wrote that he sometimes found himself wondering whether the creatures had truly buried themselves, in any conventional sense. Perhaps they had found a way to transform, to transition from physical existence into something else entirely, something operating according to different laws and inhabiting different dimensions of reality. Their physical remains were simply abandoned vessels, but the consciousness that had once occupied those vessels persisted, in ways no human science could measure or detect. If that were true, Whitfield wrote, then the creatures weren't extinct at all. They had simply evolved beyond any need for physical form. Vernon set the letter aside and walked out onto his porch. The mountains stretched before him in the afternoon light, ridge upon ridge dissolving into blue distance. He had spent his entire life in these mountains, had believed he understood them completely, knew their moods and dangers and hidden places. But now he saw that he had only ever perceived the thinnest surface of a reality far more ancient and complex than anything he'd imagined. Somewhere out there, perhaps 20 miles to the southeast, the valley waited with its cairn markers and its mass graves. Other people would find it eventually. Vernon had no illusions about that. Curiosity and greed would lead them in, just as those forces had led him. They would dig up more skulls, handle more bones, and in doing so receive the inheritance the creatures had prepared, experience the same visions, and come to carry the same dangerous knowledge that Vernon now bore. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the creatures had understood precisely what would happen when their remains were disturbed. Perhaps the whole arrangement had been intentional. Not burial at all, but propagation, a way of ensuring that what they had learned and known would survive, even after their physical extinction. Vernon could not stop what was coming. He could only decide whether to be part of it or step aside. He thought about Whitfield's offer of $1,000 for the spring expedition, money that would solve his immediate problems and open doors he'd never thought within reach. But he also thought about Hadley Morris dying alone in a rooming house, scrawling warnings in his own blood. He thought about students breaking down and drivers losing their minds and night watchmen dying of fright. No amount of money was worth that. Nothing was. Vernon went back inside and wrote a letter to Professor Whitfield, telling him he would not be taking part in any future expeditions to the valley. He offered no explanation. The professor would understand. He sealed the letter and set it aside to mail on his next trip to town. Then he sat at his table and tried to work out what to do with the rest of his life, now that he saw what he saw, knew what he knew, and understood what he understood. The mountains were beautiful in the fading light, their ridges cutting sharp lines against the sky. Vernon watched them and wondered how many other valleys harbored similar secrets, how many other burial sites lay waiting to be found, how many other extinct species had left their knowledge encoded in bone and ash. He wondered whether humanity was ready for those discoveries, or whether, like him, we would learn too much and find ourselves unable to forget. The sun sank behind the western peaks and darkness came to the mountains. Vernon sat in his cabin with the lamp unlit, looking out at the night, and somewhere in that darkness he felt them watching. Not threatening, not hostile. Just watching, waiting to see what humanity would do with the inheritance they had been given. Years later, Vernon would sometimes share pieces of this story with people he trusted, though he always withheld the most disturbing details, the visions, the knowledge, the sense of being observed by consciousnesses that no longer required physical form. People would listen politely and put it down to mountain superstition, or the tall tales of a man who'd spent too many years alone. But those who knew Vernon well noticed the changes in him. He stopped hunting except when absolute necessity demanded it. He avoided certain parts of the mountains without ever explaining why. And on clear nights he would stand on his porch for hours, watching the ridgelines as if looking for something, or as if he could perceive things moving in the darkness that others simply couldn't see. He never married, never left the mountains, never spoke publicly about what he had found in that valley in 1898. The location died with him when he passed away in 1936 at the age of 75. And whatever skulls remained buried there stayed buried, their knowledge and their warnings sealed in mineralized bone, waiting for the next person curious or foolish enough to disturb them. Because there is always a next person. There is always someone who hears the stories, dismisses the warnings, and decides to find out for themselves. And when they find what Vernon found, when they hold those skulls in their hands and feel the transfer of awareness that comes with contact, when they see the visions and take on the knowledge, they will understand what he understood, that we share this world with forms of consciousness we have barely begun to imagine. That intelligence has risen and fallen many times across the span of Earth's history, and that some of those lost intelligences left behind gifts, or warnings, or traps that we are only now beginning to uncover. So tell me, have you ever experienced something that made you question the nature of reality itself? Something that science couldn't quite account for? Leave your stories in the comments. I read every single one. And who knows, maybe your experience becomes our next story. As always, stay curious, but stay careful. Some knowledge carries a price, and not every discovery should be made